Hi class, today I'd like to go over chapter 12, which is related to television, computers, and then schooling. So let's go ahead and get started. So your chapter first begins by talking about television and television consumption. While these statistics are a little bit dated, I actually think that they're probably lower than what we see now, simply because we're consuming media almost constantly, right? So at the time your textbook was written, the statistic that was noted was that children 3 to 11 watch an average of about 2 to 4 hours of television a day. And when you consider that by the age of 5, we're going to school, by 6, we're in school all day, and that children's bedtimes might actually be particularly earlier, that 2 to 4 hours is a significant amount of time to be spending watching television. Your book then goes on to note that by age 18, that a child will spend more time watching television than doing anything else outside of sleeping. So to think that, after sleep, which is vital to us as human beings, the very next thing that pops up is, this media consumption, or particularly television watching. In fact, a study in 1967 wanted to see how families were influenced by television. And surprisingly, the authors found that a majority of families altered their sleeping patterns and meal times to be centered around when TV shows play. Now, you have to remember, you couldn't just DVR the television show or even live, stream it on Netflix or Hulu or something else. And so, the time that the show was on was the time that you would need to watch it, right? So that really influenced a lot of people, a lot of families, and the study really captured that. So what do we find as a result of this TV watching? Well, there's a decreased amount of time then that parents are spending with their children in activities outside of that TV consumption. In fact, many people might use the TV as an electronic babysitter. I think we've transitioned a little bit to maybe phones and tablets, right? I don't know how many times you've been out, maybe even eating dinner with your family, and you kind of look around and there are people at dinner together and it's like the whole family is just sitting there looking at their phone, which is so crazy, right? You're spending this time, this energy, this money to come out to eat. And instead of sitting there enjoying everyone's company, it's kind of that everybody's being consumed by the media, taking photos, posting it on Instagram, snapping about it, right? Whatever that is, as opposed to sort of living in that moment. Bronfenbrenner talks about what types of behaviors then that watching TV prevents. It prevents talking. It prevents, even the playing of games or general family festivities, arguments, all of these things through which learning, particularly when we are children, take place. And he argues that it's through these types of things how our character actually ends up being formed. He has this quote, and I'm going to read it to you because I think it's really very profound. He says, "Turning on the television can turn off the process that transforms children into people." And so at the expense of spending our time in front of the television, it's almost that we're missing out on life and these activities that make us who we are. Now, you may or may not agree with this as a sentiment, but it's rather interesting to think about and kind of contemplate. We might then ask ourselves, right, is TV viewing as harmful to family life and social development as, some of the early critics in your book have stated? Well, one way that we can take a look at this is by taking a look at the impact that television has on children who may not have had access to it. Right? So maybe children who live in remote areas, who have not, had that same amount of TV consumption. And so authors did just that, right? Some researchers did just that. They actually went to Canada and they had taken a look at the kids in the town, Notel, and they found that they tested the children on reading and creativity. And in general, these children actually tested higher as compared to cities where television already existed. 2 to 4 years later, they went back into these same towns. And by then, we started to see more and more televisions in the homes. And what they found is that there was a decline in the level of reading and creativity in just that short 2 to 4 years that the televisions were introduced. So this is quite, this is a really interesting and very neat way to see the effects of media consumption. Some people might worry about peer relationships and how they may be affected. Currently we don't really see a lot of evidence suggesting that it may be harmful for peer relations, but I will talk to you in just a second about aggression. And I think that we could see that in terms of relationships with others, right? So your book then goes on to talk about violence in television. And unsurprisingly, American television is extremely violent. In fact, 80% of primetime TV shows have at least one incidence of physical violence within that program. It is estimated then in your book that by the age of 16, children would have already witnessed over 13,000 killings on TV. And we're going to talk about desensitization in just a little bit, but I want you to think about what happens when we constantly see those killing, those types of violence and killing on TV. When we went back and we kind of took a look at this, and we're not talking about just present day television, but when we were looking and analyzing sort of older television shows, it's very surprising that most violent programs were designed for children. Think about Saturday morning cartoons. If you ever used to watch them, I think about like the Roadrunner and the Coyote. The entire cartoon was about the coyote trying to hurt the Roadrunner, right? And inevitably getting hurt himself. And this is just one of many cartoons that used to play for children, and it was geared for children. So the violence isn't just in our modern day television shows centered around plot lines that have killings. So things like CSI or Criminal Minds. I mean, this goes far beyond that, right? Violence has been a part of America's TV consumption for probably the duration of, our culture, as long as we've had TV. In fact, the rates of violence remain pretty stable since the late 1960s. We might argue, however, that the realism in which some of that violence is now portrayed significantly surpasses the types of violence that was, appeared before. We think about a shooting in an old Western. How does that compare to something more modern, right? How much more realistic does that killing look now than perhaps it did in, just a few decades ago? In terms of aggression and mass media, we have taken a look at some of the research showing us the relationship between these two things. Research has shown us that exposure to violent television does in fact lead to more aggressive behavior. Exposure to images of sex does in fact affect adolescents' attitudes about sex. Exposure to images of drug and alcohol use does in fact affect adolescents' beliefs about drug and alcohol use, right? So, to say that there's no relationship is definitely inaccurate. The watching and the exposure